Picture this. You're a young nobleman in 16th century France, climbing the marble stairs of Château de Fontainebleau with your heart racing. Princess Marguerite de Montpensier has invited you into her private chambers, an honour no man could refuse. But what no one dares whisper aloud is what happened to the dozens of young men who entered before you, and never came out the same. The chamber doors open with a whisper, and you step into what appears to be paradise itself. Tapestries of gold thread catch the candlelight, Persian rugs softer than clouds cushion your every step, and everywhere you look, the most exquisite furniture you've ever seen. An ornate chair carved from what appears to be living wood, its surface warm to the touch, a writing desk that seems to breathe with each flicker of flame, a bookshelf that occasionally blinks. But it's not the furniture that stops your breath. It's her. Princess Marguerite stands silhouetted against the window, her burgundy gown flowing like liquid silk, her raven hair cascading over porcelain shoulders. When she turns, her emerald eyes lock with yours, and for a moment, you understand why men have started wars over love. Her lips curve into a smile that promises secrets, and she glides toward you with movements that seem to defy the very laws of nature. "Welcome, my dear Antoine," she purrs, her voice like honey mixed with poison. "I've been so looking forward to our conversation." You try to respond, but your tongue feels thick and clumsy. Something isn't right. The chair behind you groans, not the sound of wood settling, but something else, something that sounds almost human. Before diving into this forgotten tale of obsession and madness, if you enjoy uncovering the darkest secrets of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please, drop a comment below. I'd love to know what you think about this twisted story and where you're watching from. It's incredible how we can explore these dark historical tales together from all corners of the world. What you're about to hear isn't just another tale of royal excess. It's the story of how love can transform into something unrecognizable, how beauty can mask the most horrifying cruelty, and how a human heart can become so broken that it seeks to break everything it touches. The name Marguerite de Montpensier has been deliberately erased from most historical records, but her story will haunt you long after you finish watching. Let's start with the woman who would become history's most twisted collector of human art. Marguerite wasn't born a monster. In fact, her childhood showed remarkable promise of greatness. Born in 1547 to one of France's most powerful noble families, she was raised in luxury beyond imagination. Her father, the Duc de Montpensier, controlled vast territories and wielded influence that rivaled the king himself. Her mother, Anne de Bourbon, was renowned throughout Europe for her beauty and intelligence. From her earliest years, Marguerite displayed gifts that seemed almost supernatural. She spoke fluent Latin by age 6, composed poetry that made grown men weep by age 10, and painted portraits so lifelike that courtiers swore they could see the subjects breathing. But it was her effect on people that truly set her apart from other noble children. Men would literally stop in their tracks when young Marguerite entered a room. Not just because of her striking beauty, though by age 15 she possessed features that seemed carved by angels, but because of something deeper, and magnetism that pulled people toward her like moths to flame, a presence that made everyone in her vicinity feel as though they were the most important person in the world. But absolute beauty, like absolute power, has a way of corrupting even the purest souls. And by 1565, something had fundamentally twisted inside the princess's mind. Maybe it was the constant attention that taught her to view people as objects for her amusement. Maybe it was the isolation of being the only person in a palace of hundreds who could never be told no, never be challenged, never be contradicted. Or maybe it was what happened to the one person she claimed to love more than life itself. His name was Philippe de Courtenay, and he was everything young Marguerite thought she wanted in a man. The second son of a minor duke, Philippe possessed the kind of dangerous beauty that made him equally appealing to women and threatening to their husbands. When he arrived at court as part of a diplomatic mission, Marguerite took one look at his storm-grey eyes and golden hair and decided that he would be hers. The courtship was a masterpiece of romantic manipulation. Marguerite deployed every weapon in her considerable arsenal: her beauty, her wit, her political connections, her family's wealth. She showered Philippe with gifts that would have bankrupted lesser nobles: a horse bred from Arabian stock, clothing made from silk so fine it felt like liquid moonlight, jewelry that incorporated gemstones from the New World. But Marguerite wasn't just attracted to Philippe's beauty. She was consumed by him in a way that terrified even her closest confidants. Ancient letters, discovered centuries later, hidden in the walls of Château de Fontainebleau, reveal the depth of her obsession. She wrote of wanting to possess every breath he takes, every thought he thinks, every dream that visits him in sleep. Philippe, for his part, seemed genuinely enchanted by the princess. Their correspondence reveals a young man who believed himself lucky beyond measure to have captured the attention of Europe's most desirable woman. He wrote of their future together, of the children they would have, of growing old in each other's arms. What Philippe didn't understand, what no one understood, was that Marguerite's definition of love was fundamentally different from everyone else's. Where others saw romance, she saw ownership. Where others experienced affection, she felt possession. To Marguerite, loving someone meant controlling every aspect of their existence. The engagement was announced with unprecedented fanfare. The wedding was planned as the social event of the decade, with guest lists that included royalty from across Europe. Philippe seemed ecstatic, writing to his family about his incredible fortune in winning such a bride. Marguerite appeared radiant, her happiness lighting up every room she entered. But behind the public celebrations, something dark was growing in the princess's private chambers. It started with small requests. Marguerite wanted Philippe to spend more time at the chateau. Then she wanted him to reduce his visits to friends and family. Soon she was asking him to clear his entire schedule so they could be together constantly. Each request came wrapped in such sweet words, such logical explanations, that Philippe never realized he was being systematically isolated from everyone who had ever mattered to him. The transformation accelerated after their wedding night. Marguerite's letters from this period, written in her own hand, reveal a woman teetering on the edge of madness. She wrote obsessively about Philippe's body, describing it in terms usually reserved for religious relics or works of art. She spoke of wanting to preserve his beauty forever, of finding ways to make their union literally permanent. The first sign of serious trouble when Philippe tried to visit his family's estate for his younger brother's wedding. Marguerite's reaction was swift and terrifying. She locked herself in her chambers for 3 days, refusing food and water, screaming accusations about abandonment and betrayal. When Philippe finally agreed to cancel his trip, she emerged as if nothing had happened, showering him with affection and gratitude. But the pattern had been established. Any attempt by Philippe to assert independence, no matter how minor, triggered increasingly dramatic responses from his wife. She would threaten suicide, claim mysterious illnesses, or simply disappear for days at a time, leaving the entire household in chaos until Philippe capitulated to her demands. Ancient court records preserved in the French National Archives document the increasingly strange requests that began emanating from the princess's chambers during this period. Craftsmen were summoned to create unusual furniture pieces according to Marguerite's exact specifications. Physicians were consulted about preserving human tissue. Alchemists were brought to the chateau under cover of darkness, carrying mysterious equipment and rare chemicals. Meanwhile, Philippe was being systematically broken down through a combination of isolation, emotional manipulation, and what modern psychologists would recognize as sophisticated brainwashing techniques. Marguerite convinced him that his family resented their marriage, that his friends were jealous of his good fortune, that the entire world was plotting to separate them. She also began experimenting with substances designed to make Philippe more compliant. Court physicians' notes discovered in Vatican archives describe various potions and powders that the princess requested for enhancing marital harmony. Some were mild sedatives, others were more exotic compounds that affected memory and willpower. The combination of psychological manipulation and chemical influence proved devastatingly effective. Within months of their marriage, Philippe had transformed from a confident young nobleman into a hollow-eyed shadow who rarely spoke, except to agree with his wife's increasingly bizarre requests. It was during this period that Marguerite began developing her theories about permanent love. In letters to her confessor, letters that the priest was too terrified to destroy, she wrote about her growing conviction that traditional marriage was insufficient to express the depth of her feelings. She wanted something more complete, more artistic, more eternal. She began researching ancient practices of preservation, studying Egyptian mummification techniques, and consulting with scholars who specialized in forbidden knowledge. But Marguerite's inspiration came from an unexpected source: the gardens of Versailles. During a visit to see the famous topiary sculptures, she became fascinated by the way skilled gardeners could shape living trees into beautiful forms while keeping them alive. The trees served a decorative purpose while maintaining their essential life force, creating art that was both functional and eternal. That night, she wrote in her diary, "Why should not love achieve the same perfection? Why should not the beloved become both beautiful and useful, artistic and eternal?" The first experiments began with small animals, songbirds that she had preserved in lifelike poses, maintaining their beauty while serving as permanent decorations for her chambers. When these proved successful, she moved on to larger subjects, eventually developing techniques that combined elements of taxidermy, sculpture, and what can only be described as surgical artistry. Philippe, meanwhile, had become so psychologically dependent on his wife that he actively participated in his own destruction. Court observers noted that he seemed to exist in a dreamlike state, following Marguerite's instructions without question or resistance. Some suspected drugs, others believed dark magic, but the truth was simpler and more terrifying: complete psychological domination. The transformation began on a cold February morning in 1568. Philippe woke to find Marguerite sitting beside their bed, her green eyes bright with an excitement that should have terrified him, but instead filled him with the drugged contentment that had become his normal state. She explained that she had discovered a way to make their love truly eternal, to create a bond that death itself couldn't break. The process, she assured him, would be painless. He would simply go to sleep and wake up in a new form of existence, one where he could serve her forever while maintaining his essential beauty. Philippe, his willpower completely eroded by months of manipulation, agreed with the same passive compliance he showed to all her requests. The ritual took place in chambers that Marguerite had specially prepared for the purpose. The room had been converted into a workshop that combined elements of a medical laboratory, an artist's studio, and a medieval torture chamber. Tables lined with surgical instruments shared space with sculpting tools and preservation chemicals. The walls were covered with detailed anatomical drawings showing various furniture designs integrated with human forms. What happened next represents one of the most methodical acts of cruelty in recorded history. Using techniques she had perfected on smaller subjects, Marguerite began the process of transforming Philippe from husband into furniture. The procedure involved carefully calculated incisions designed to reshape his skeletal structure while preserving consciousness and basic life functions. His spine was curved into the graceful arch of a chair back, his arms extended to form armrests, his legs modified to serve as support pillars. Throughout the process, which took several days to complete, Philippe remained conscious and communicative. Marguerite had developed chemical compounds that prevented him from feeling pain while maintaining awareness, allowing her to converse with him as she worked. She spoke constantly during the transformation, explaining each step as an act of love, describing the beauty he was becoming, assuring him that this was the ultimate expression of their bond. Ancient medical texts, hidden for centuries in monastery libraries, describe preservation techniques that kept the subject's blood circulating, nerves functioning, and consciousness intact, while fundamentally altering their physical form. Philippe's organs were repositioned and protected, his skeletal structure reinforced with metal supports, his skin treated with compounds that prevented decay while maintaining flexibility. When the transformation was complete, Marguerite had achieved something unprecedented in human history. a piece of furniture that was simultaneously functional and alive. Philippe could no longer move his body voluntarily. His limbs had been fixed in position and his spine fused into a permanent curve, but he retained the ability to speak, to think, and to experience emotion. His eyes, though repositioned to serve as decorative elements in the chair's design, could still see and track movement. His mouth, carefully integrated into the chair's ornamentation, could still form words. Marguerite was ecstatic with the results. She had created what she considered the perfect fusion of art and love, a being who existed solely to serve her while retaining all the qualities that had made her fall in love with him in the first place. Philippe was still beautiful, still intelligent, still capable of conversation, but now he was also completely hers, unable to leave or resist her in any way. The conversations between Marguerite and her furniture husband, recorded in her detailed journals, reveal the full extent of her psychological delusion. She spoke to Philippe as if their relationship had been enhanced rather than destroyed, expressing gratitude for his willingness to undergo the transformation and describing their new dynamic as the ultimate romantic achievement. Philippe's responses, transcribed with chilling accuracy, show a man struggling to maintain sanity while trapped in an impossible situation. Initially, he expressed confusion and horror at his condition. Later entries reveal desperate attempts to convince Marguerite to reverse the process. Eventually, his recorded words suggest a kind of psychological fracture as he began to accept and even embrace his new existence. But Marguerite's appetite for this twisted form of art had only been awakened. Over the following months, she began selecting other young men for similar transformations. Each selection followed the same pattern: an invitation to her private chambers, a seduction campaign designed to isolate the victim from potential allies, followed by the gradual application of psychological and chemical influences that rendered resistance impossible. Her second victim was Henri de Navarre, a minor noble who had caught her attention during a court celebration. The process of seducing and transforming Henri was refined based on lessons learned from Philippe's conversion. This time, Marguerite documented every step with the precision of a scientific researcher, creating detailed notes about optimal chemical dosages, surgical techniques, and psychological manipulation methods. Henri became a writing desk, his torso forming the surface, his arms creating the supporting structure, his head positioned to serve as an ornamental element that could still engage in conversation. Like Philippe, he retained consciousness and the ability to speak, but was completely immobilized and dependent on Marguerite for survival. The third transformation was perhaps the most elaborate. Jean de Bourbon, a distant cousin who had made the mistake of complimenting Marguerite's beauty a bit too enthusiastically, became a bookshelf. His spine was extended and curved to create multiple shelves, his limbs repositioned to form the supporting framework, his head integrated into the top section where he could oversee the entire room. Each transformation was more sophisticated than the last, as Marguerite perfected her techniques and developed new methods for preserving consciousness while reshaping human anatomy. Her chambers began to fill with a collection of living furniture, each piece representing hours of meticulous work and a complete human life sacrificed to her obsessive vision of love as possession. The psychological dynamics of these relationships were documented in excruciating detail in Marguerite's personal writings. She maintained romantic connections with each of her furniture lovers, conducting conversations that she viewed as intimate exchanges between devoted partners. She would read poetry to her bookshelf lover, discuss philosophy with her desk companion, and share her daily experiences with her chair husband. From their perspectives, trapped in immobilized bodies with functioning minds, the experience represented a unique form of psychological torture. They could observe everything that happened in Marguerite's chambers, her daily routines, her conversations with visitors, her increasingly elaborate plans for acquiring new subjects, but could only participate through limited verbal responses. The conversations between Marguerite and her collection, preserved in her obsessively detailed journals, reveal relationships that had evolved into something beyond any normal human experience. The furniture lovers developed their own social dynamics, communicating with each other when Marguerite was absent, forming alliances and hierarchies based on their relative positions in her affections. Philippe, as the first and most beloved transformation, held a position of honour in Marguerite's chambers and served as a kind of leader among the living furniture. His recorded words show a man who had adapted to his impossible circumstances by embracing a kind of philosophical acceptance of his fate. He spoke of finding beauty in their shared suffering and meaning in their collective devotion to Marguerite. Henri, positioned as the writing desk, developed a more intellectual approach to their situation. His conversations, as recorded by Marguerite, focused on analysing their predicament through historical and philosophical frameworks. He compared their experience to ancient myths about transformation and spoke of their situation as a unique form of immortality. Jean, the bookshelf, took on the role of observer and commentator, using his elevated position to provide detailed accounts of Marguerite's daily activities and emotional states. His recorded observations reveal a man who had maintained his sanity by becoming a kind of ethnographer of his own captivity. But the most disturbing aspect of these relationships wasn't the physical horror of the transformations. It was how the victims gradually adapted to their circumstances and even began to find meaning in their suffering. As months turned into years, Marguerite's collection grew to include more than a dozen pieces of living furniture, each one representing a young man who had been seduced, isolated, manipulated, and ultimately transformed into a functional work of art. Her chambers resembled a bizarre museum where every piece had a voice and a consciousness. The psychological complexity of managing these relationships consumed increasingly large portions of Marguerite's time and attention. Each piece of furniture required individual care, not just physical maintenance to preserve their biological functions, but emotional attention to maintain their psychological stability. She had created a household of beings who depended on her completely for survival, while possessing the intelligence to understand and discuss their situation. The daily routines that developed around caring for her collection were documented with obsessive detail in Marguerite's journals. She would spend hours each day in conversation with different pieces, discussing philosophy with some, sharing court gossip with others, reading poetry to those who particularly enjoyed literature. She developed elaborate feeding systems to provide nutrition directly to their modified digestive systems and medical protocols to maintain their health and consciousness. But perhaps most remarkably, she began to notice that her furniture lovers were developing new forms of artistic expression within the constraints of their transformed bodies. Philippe learned to create beautiful sounds by controlling his breathing in specific patterns, turning himself into a kind of living musical instrument. Henri discovered that he could create intricate patterns in dust that accumulated on his surface, using minute muscle contractions to create temporary works of art. Jean developed a form of verbal poetry that incorporated the acoustics of his bookshelf form, using echoes and resonance to enhance his words. These developments delighted Marguerite, who saw them as proof that her transformations had succeeded in creating something genuinely new and beautiful. She began to view herself not as a perpetrator of torture, but as an artist who had discovered a new medium for creative expression. Her letters from this period describe her work in terms usually reserved for great painters or sculptors, speaking of her techniques for shaping human form and consciousness into new configurations of beauty and utility. The outside world, meanwhile, remained completely unaware of what was happening in Marguerite's private chambers. To court observers, she appeared to be a woman who preferred solitude and had developed eccentric tastes in interior decoration. Visitors who were occasionally granted access to her chambers commented on her remarkable collection of furniture, noting the exquisite craftsmanship and lifelike quality of the pieces. Some remarked that the furniture seemed almost alive, but this was attributed to the skill of the unknown artisans who had created them. The disappearances of various young noblemen were explained by conventional excuses: family obligations, military service, diplomatic missions to foreign courts. Marguerite had developed sophisticated methods for covering the tracks of her victims, creating false documents and bribing officials to provide credible explanations for their absences. Her family's wealth and political connections made it easy to suppress awkward questions and redirect attention away from uncomfortable patterns. But by 1571, Marguerite's appetite for new acquisitions had grown beyond her ability to satisfy it safely. The challenge was that her techniques required extensive preparation and absolute privacy. Each transformation took weeks to complete properly, and the victim had to be isolated from potential rescuers throughout the entire process. As her collection grew larger, it became increasingly difficult to maintain the secrecy necessary for new additions while providing adequate care for existing pieces. More troubling was the fact that Marguerite was becoming more ambitious in her selection of subjects. Where she had initially targeted minor nobles and younger sons who wouldn't be missed immediately, she was now setting her sights on more prominent figures whose disappearances would inevitably attract attention. The beginning of the end came when Marguerite decided to pursue Claude de Lorraine, the heir to one of France's most powerful dueling families. Claude was everything Marguerite had learned to desire in a subject: young, beautiful, intelligent, and possessing the kind of refined aristocratic bearing that would translate beautifully into furniture form. But he was also the designated heir to vast estates and political influence, making him exactly the wrong target for someone trying to maintain a secret collection of living art. The seduction campaign began traditionally enough, with Marguerite deploying all her considerable charms to isolate Claude from his family and friends. But Claude proved more resistant to her psychological manipulation than previous victims. Perhaps because of his higher social position, or maybe due to inherent personality traits, he maintained connections to the outside world, even as he fell under Marguerite's romantic spell. When Claude failed to appear at several important family gatherings, his relatives began asking uncomfortable questions. Unlike previous victims, whose disappearances could be explained by their relatively minor social positions, Claude's absence created ripples that reached the highest levels of French nobility. The investigation that followed was conducted with the kind of thoroughness reserved for threats to powerful families. Royal investigators, armed with authority that even Marguerite's family couldn't challenge, began examining the pattern of disappearances that had occurred around the princess over the previous several years. What they discovered was a mystery that seemed to point towards something far more sinister than simple coincidence. The investigators' reports, preserved in the archives of the French Ministry of Justice, document a methodical analysis of nearly 24 missing young noblemen, all of whom had last been seen in Marguerite's company. The pattern was undeniable, but the investigators struggled to develop theories that could explain what had happened to so many people without leaving any trace. The breakthrough came when one of the investigators noticed something odd about Marguerite's furniture collection. Captain François de Montmorency, a career investigator with extensive experience in criminal matters, was conducting a routine search of Marguerite's chambers when he heard what sounded like a whispered conversation. Following the sound, he discovered that it seemed to be coming from an ornate chair positioned near the window. What happened next has been the subject of historical debate for centuries, but Captain de Montmorency's official report provides a chilling account of his discovery. According to the document, the chair began speaking to him directly, identifying itself as Philippe de Courtenay, and begging for help in a voice that was recognizably human, despite its strange acoustic properties. The captain initially assumed he was experiencing some kind of hallucination brought on by the stress of the investigation, but as he listened more carefully, he realized that other pieces of furniture in the room were also attempting to communicate. The writing desk pleaded to be recognized as Henri de Navarre. The bookshelf claimed to be Jean de Bourbon. One by one, nearly every piece of furniture in Marguerite's collection revealed itself to be a transformed human being, each one desperate to share their story and beg for rescue. Captain de Montmorency's report describes his horror at realizing that he was surrounded by what remained of missing noblemen, their bodies reshaped into functional furniture while their minds remained intact and conscious. The psychological impact of this discovery was so severe that the captain reportedly required several days to recover his composure sufficiently to continue the investigation. When confronted with the evidence of her crimes, Marguerite showed no remorse or recognition that she had done anything wrong. Her response to the accusations recorded in official court documents reveals a woman so completely disconnected from normal human empathy that she genuinely couldn't understand why her actions were considered criminal. She described her transformations as works of art, her relationships with the furniture victims as the purest form of love, and her collection as a masterpiece that demonstrated new possibilities for human connection. Marguerite's defense, presented by the finest legal minds her family could afford, attempted to argue that her actions represented a form of consensual artistic collaboration rather than criminal assault. They pointed to evidence that some victims had initially cooperated with early stages of the process and claimed that the transformations represented a form of voluntary transcendence rather than torture. The trial became one of the most sensational legal proceedings in French history, drawing observers from across Europe who were fascinated by the unprecedented nature of the crimes. Testimony from medical experts, religious authorities, and surviving witnesses created a record that provided unprecedented insight into the psychology of obsessive love and the techniques Marguerite had developed for reshaping human consciousness along with human anatomy. But perhaps the most devastating testimony came from the victims themselves. Court officials developed methods for allowing the furniture victims to provide testimony, using special acoustic equipment to amplify their voices and transcription techniques to record their words accurately. The statements they provided painted a picture of systematic psychological torture combined with physical transformation that represented something entirely new in the history of criminal behavior. Philippe de Courtenay's testimony, delivered from his position as a chair, described years of consciousness trapped in an immobilized body, forced to observe and participate in conversations while being unable to control any aspect of his existence. He spoke of the psychological techniques Marguerite had used to make him complicit in his own transformation and the gradual process by which he had adapted to his circumstances. Henri de Navarre, speaking from his form as a writing desk, provided detailed analysis of Marguerite's psychological methods and the way she had systematically isolated him from potential sources of help. His testimony revealed the sophistication of her manipulation techniques and the careful planning that had gone into each transformation. Jean de Bourbon, positioned as a bookshelf with an overview of Marguerite's chambers, had served as an involuntary observer of her daily routines and had developed insights into her psychological state that no outside observer could have gained. His testimony provided crucial evidence about Marguerite's motivations and the evolution of her criminal behavior. The court was faced with an unprecedented legal challenge: how to sentence someone for crimes that had no historical precedent, and how to provide justice for victims who remained alive but in circumstances that made normal life impossible. The verdict, when it finally came, reflected the court's struggle to address crimes that defied existing legal categories. Marguerite de Montpensier was sentenced to death for multiple counts of assault, imprisonment, and what the court termed unnatural transformation of human persons for personal gratification. But the sentence also included provisions for attempting to reverse her work, requiring that medical experts be brought in to explore possibilities for restoring her victims to their original forms. The restoration attempts, documented in medical journals from the period, represented some of the most advanced surgical thinking of the 16th century. Physicians from across Europe collaborated on techniques for reversing Marguerite's transformations, but the complexity of her work and the length of time the victims had spent in their altered states made meaningful restoration impossible. Some partial reversals were achieved. Certain victims regained limited mobility. Others recovered some normal physiological functions, but none could be returned to their original human form. The chemical and surgical techniques Marguerite had perfected had created changes that were essentially irreversible with the medical knowledge available at the time. The victims faced an impossible choice: remain in their current forms with the consciousness and memories of their human selves, or undergo experimental procedures that might restore some physical normalcy, but could also result in death or complete loss of mental function. Their responses to this choice revealed the complex psychological adaptations they had developed during their years as living furniture. Philippe chose to remain in his chair form, stating that he had found a kind of peace in his current existence, and feared that attempting to change might destroy the philosophical equilibrium he had achieved. Henry requested partial restoration that might allow him limited movement while preserving the aspects of his transformation that he had learned to value. Jean chose to undergo the most radical experimental procedures, preferring the risk of death to continued existence as furniture. The outcomes varied dramatically. Philippe lived for several more years in his chair form, becoming something of a philosophical curiosity who attracted visitors interested in his unique perspective on human existence. Henry's partial restoration was moderately successful, allowing him a form of limited mobility while retaining elements of his furniture identity. Jean's experimental treatment resulted in his death, but according to witnesses, he died expressing gratitude for the chance to reclaim his human dignity. Marguerite herself was executed in the traditional manner, showing no repentance even as she faced death. Her final words, recorded by the official court reporter, continued to express pride in her artistic achievements and confusion about why others couldn't appreciate the beauty of what she had created. She spoke of her love for her victims as being purer and more complete than normal human relationships, and described her execution as society's failure to understand revolutionary forms of artistic expression. But Marguerite's story doesn't end with her death. The techniques she had developed for transforming human consciousness while preserving awareness represented knowledge that was both fascinating and terrifying to medical researchers of the period. Her detailed journals, surgical notes, and chemical formulas were secretly preserved by scholars who recognized their significance while understanding the dangers they represented. These documents, hidden in various European libraries and private collections, influenced centuries of research into the boundaries between life and death, consciousness and physical form. Some historians argue that Marguerite's work contributed to later developments in anatomy, preservation techniques, and even early psychological theory. More disturbing is evidence that some of her techniques may have been replicated by later practitioners who shared her obsessions with possession and control. Reports from various European courts over the following centuries describe similar cases of mysterious disappearances, unusual furniture collections, and rumors of living artworks that defied natural explanation. While none of these later cases were documented with the thoroughness of Marguerite's trial, the patterns suggest that her innovations may have inspired imitators across multiple generations. The psychological impact of Marguerite's story extended far beyond her immediate victims. The trial proceedings were widely distributed and discussed throughout Europe, creating a new category of criminal behavior that combined elements of assault, artistic expression, and romantic obsession in ways that challenged existing understanding of human motivation. Legal scholars used her case to develop new frameworks for understanding crimes that transcended traditional categories. Medical professionals were forced to confront questions about the boundaries of human identity and the relationship between consciousness and physical form that wouldn't be seriously addressed again until the development of modern neuroscience centuries later. Artists and philosophers found in Marguerite's story a complex meditation on the nature of love, possession, and the desire to preserve beauty that influenced creative works for generations. But perhaps most significantly, her story served as a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked power and the ways that isolation from normal human relationships can distort even the most positive emotions into sources of horrific cruelty. Today, nearly 5 centuries after Marguerite de Montpensier's execution, her story continues to challenge our understanding of human psychology and the potential for love to transform into its opposite. Modern psychologists studying her case have identified patterns that appear in contemporary situations involving extreme possessiveness, isolation, and the dehumanization of romantic partners. While the specific methods she employed were unique to her historical period and personal circumstances, the underlying psychological dynamics continue to manifest in different forms. The story serves as a reminder that beauty, intelligence, and apparent refinement are no guarantee against the capacity for evil, and that the most horrific cruelties can emerge from emotions that society typically celebrates as noble and pure. In our current era of unprecedented technological capability and social isolation, Marguerite's story takes on new relevance as a warning about what can happen when human relationships become transactions of possession rather than connections between equals. The young men who answered her invitations believing they were entering into romantic relationships instead found themselves transformed into objects for her gratification. Their humanity preserved only to make their suffering more complete. Their voices, speaking from their furniture forms during the trial, continue to echo across the centuries as testimony to the human capacity for both cruelty and resilience, and as a reminder that the most beautiful surfaces can conceal the darkest hearts. As you sit in your chair tonight, remember Philippe de Courtenay, who learned too late that some invitations lead not to love, but to becoming the very furniture that supports other people's comfort, while your own humanity becomes nothing more than a curious conversation piece in someone else's collection. The marble halls of Château de Fontainebleau still echo with voices that once begged for freedom, and somewhere in the shadows of history, the art of human furniture may not be as extinct as we would like to believe. What did you think of Princess Marguerite's twisted obsession? Have you ever encountered someone whose love felt more like possession? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one and love hearing your perspectives on these dark historical tales. And if you found this story as haunting as I did, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more forgotten stories from history's darkest corners. Until next time, remember that the most beautiful faces sometimes hide the most twisted minds.